Today's notes are on multiplying and dividing integers. When we say multiplying, we're talking about groups of or multiples of. And when we're talking about dividing, we're splitting things or dividing them into even pieces. And integers, again, are just positive and negative whole numbers. So -3, -4, 80, -20, all of those. It's actually pretty straightforward. Let's say that I have 6 negatives, and I want to divide it into 2 equal groups, or -6 and divide by 2. Well, if I divide it into 2 equal groups, each of those groups would have 3 negatives in it. The same is true for multiplying. If I have 2 groups of -3, then altogether I have 6 negatives. We can also show multiplication on a table. So for example, anything times 0 is 0. So when -3 times 0 is 0. If I have -3 one time, that's just a -3. If I have -3 twice, that's -6. If I have -3 3 times, it's -9. And you'll notice our pattern that each row I'm adding 3 to it. The same is going to be true here. I add 3 to give me +3, which might be a little confusing because now you have 2 negatives, and whenever we were adding -3 subtract 1, I kept the negative at -4. But think about it this way. If I have -3 one time, and then I find the opposite of that, it's going to give me a +3. Or you could look at it this way. The opposite of 3 times a -1 gives me a positive. So a -3 times -2 gives me a +6. A -3 times -3 gives me a +9. And it's keeping that pattern of adding 3 over and over. When you copy the multiplying and dividing rules into your notebook, I think it's going to be helpful if you highlight or just redraw some of these in different colors. So our positives I'm going to highlight as green, and our negatives I'm going to highlight as red. It's going to help us pay attention to some of these patterns. If I have a positive times a positive, well, that's going to give me a positive answer. If I have a negative times a positive, that's going to give me a negative answer. A positive times a negative gives me a negative answer. And 2 negatives multiplied together give me a positive. Check out those patterns. Whenever I had 2 of the same sign, like in this one and down here in this one, it gave me a positive answer in the end. And when I had 2 of different signs, it gave me a negative. The same is going to hold true for dividing. Divide 2 positives, get a positive. Divide a negative and a positive, get a negative. And then all the way at the bottom, if I divide 2 negatives, it's going to give me a positive. Let's highlight those so we can pay attention to our patterns. I have positive and positive here, and I have negative and negative here. So you'll notice that the rules match up between multiplication and division. Let's show this mathematically. If I have -8 times -5, that's in the opposite of 8 times -5, gives me a +40. For B, I also have 2 negatives multiplied together, giving me a +30. And then for C, I have 50% of -30, or half of -30, which is a -15. With example 2, we use those same rules for division. A negative divided by a negative is a +10. A negative divided by a positive is a -5. And then a third of a negative number, or taking that number and dividing by +3, is going to give me -30. Now here's 2 for you to try. Look at your rules that you wrote in your notebook for multiplying and dividing integers, and try these on your own. For the first one, I have a positive where I'm changing the sign or dividing by a negative, and that's going to give me a -5. And then for the second, I have a negative multiplied by a negative, or you could read that as like an opposite of a negative, which is going to give me a +110.